的专题演讲将邀请到北美环境教育学会执行长 Judy Browse 以及美国俄亥俄州立大学环境与自然学院科学研究所教授 Joe Hamlin 为我们进行演讲。那主题为环境教育和保育以及行为改变的关联性。那现在我们热烈欢迎主持人国立台湾师范大学环境教育研究所教授。
各位女士、各位先生，大家午安。午安。欢迎大家继续留下来到下午的这个学习哈。那这个阶段我们很高兴有2位主讲者来分享他们在这些方面的经验。第一位主讲者 Judy Browse， 她是在NAAWE 北美环教学会的这个执行长。那也是多年来从事环境教育非常努力的，你们可以从你们的手册上面看到他的这么多的工作资历哈，尤其其中有一份你们可能都在自己的书架上面已经都放了一本的，就是《野生新世界》这一本这一本是在他工作的时候在跟台湾也有合作的，所以他是长期我们的伙伴。那第2位这个 Joe Hamlin 教授，那大家更是应该在过去在林务局在好几个研讨会上面都看过。1997年，应该是1998年，他就到台湾在太鲁阁国家公园，我们一起举办了第1次的环境教育的工作坊。从那之后，他就常常回到台湾来看我们这些好朋友，所以我们非常感谢他们2位。那接下来的时间，因为已经有同步翻译机，所以我们2位讲者之间，我们就不再做任何的中断。所以我的介绍，大概就从这边就结束。接下来我就把时间交给 Judy。You don't wear your translator. You get it? Okay. It's your time.
Thank you.
No problem.
So did everybody have a good lunch?
Yes.
Yes. Really? You're all energized, right? Okay, we have got a lot planned. And did they tell you that we are going until midnight tonight? Is that okay? Okay, Joe.
So, we asked you to go out at lunch and see something you've never. We need to have the microphone for the.
Oh, here.
Sorry. We asked you to go out. Asked you to go outside and see something you hadn't seen before. I don't want to know what you saw. I want to know why you chose to see what you saw.
I saw the statue of a lion.
Why?
Yeah,
Why did you notice that?
Yeah, because it's a symbolic to the school. Because it's the same pronunciation of Chinese, the lion and the university.
Ah.
I think it's very unique.
Okay. Oh, it's fine. Somebody else. Why did you see what you saw? Yes.
The flower.
And why?
Because I have the same flower in my yard.
Ah, flower because she has the same flower in her yard, so there's an affinity. Both of those were affinity. Others. Anybody else? Why did you see what you saw?
Because today sunshine is so beautiful. So I going down the 1 floor and I saw the garden behind this building, and I saw the grass have a little flower I ever heard but never see. Wow. So 叫寿草 and so beautiful, and I'm very grateful I listened the so I 很高兴今天听到老师讲说要下去看一看，我所以亲眼看到，非常高兴。谢谢。
Can I do this assignment?
So the reason we wanted to do this was to get us thinking about why we care. Why do we care about nature? Why do we care about the environment? Why do we care about protecting and conserving? So we're going to move into dialogue a bit about conservation education, helping others learn to care and conserve.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, Wu on. Does that make sense? Good afternoon? No. Good afternoon, yes. Okay, conservation and education. What we want to talk about this afternoon is what is the role of education in helping us achieve conservation or environmental outcomes, depending on where you work. Some people work on the green issues, biodiversity, some work on the brown issues, water quality, some other issues. It's, however you say that, it's looking at how education can help us. The other thing we're going to talk about is the planning process. When you're thinking about a project, how do you plan to make sure you're thinking about people? We're going to talk about engaging people in conservation environmental planning, okay? And so we're going to start with the conservation education connection, a little bit of background. We have a resource so that every center will be getting several of these planning guides, which are also online, by the way. And then we are going to have a session, a little mini session that Joe is going to do on behavior change. Okay, sound okay? What I'd love for you all to do is thinking about, as we go through this afternoon, again, what relationship does what we're talking about relate to the centers that we're talking about here in Taiwan? How are you looking at conservation outcomes, environmental outcomes, and the role of environmental ed? So that's what we'll be focusing on, making sure we connect this to your work. But before we do that, we know that some of you are getting, a little older, losing some brain power, right?
Losing hair.
I'm talking about Joe, I'm talking about the three right here. No, okay, so what I want you to do is find a partner, okay? I'm going to give you a list of things up there and over here, whatever is easiest to see, and you're going to have 15 seconds to look at that slide. So first find a partner. Next door, somebody you haven't worked with that's sitting next to you or behind you, okay? You got that? And does everybody have a piece of paper somewhere or a card? This is your chance to win a bird for each of you, okay? We're only going to do it once. You're going to get 15 seconds, and Anne's going to keep time for me we're going to 15 seconds. So I'm going to show you a slide with a lot of stuff on it for 15 seconds. Then I'm going to take the slide away, and you have to write down everything you remember.
So every two persons work
Yes, we work together as a team, okay? Does everybody understand the directions? You got it? Okay, we're going to see if younger people or older people win. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, here we go. We've got 15 seconds. Okay, did anybody find 10 items or more? We have some with 10. Okay. Anybody 15? It's a team thing. You had how many? 14. Did anybody get 15 or more? Okay, 14. 13? How many of you had 13? Okay, you guys had 13? Okay, anybody else? Oh, wait, you guys had 13? 12. 12 doesn't count. 13's the winner. Okay, how many do you have? 14 over there. Uh-oh. They beat you. They have 14. Okay. These guys might have had 14. 14 here? Okay. We might have chocolate for some of the others. Okay. So I'm just going to go back here for a minute and you can see what you missed. Okay.
That's the same unfair.
Okay, we have just been accused of age discrimination. Okay, very good job. Now we've spurred your memory, okay? So this is a fun activity to do with young people or old people. Okay, now on to conservation. I want to talk to you about how all this started. I have spent my very long career, I am one of the old people. I've been in conservation and education for a long time, and I've worked at a number of organizations. The National Wildlife Federation, where Laura worked, I worked there, at Peace Corps, at World Wildlife Fund, Audubon, I worked on Capitol Hill. A lot of the times I spent in conservation or environmental organizations that were mission-driven organizations. They had, their goal is to protect the environment, to protect biodiversity, to clean up water, to reduce energy use, all of that. So I kept getting asked, why education in a conservation organization? What is the role of education? And how do we build a stronger conservation constituency? So in our country, some of the conservation organizations are, the members are older people, and they're mostly older women. Okay, so what about the young people? What about people of color? How do we build a stronger conservation constituency? So then my colleagues who are in science or in policy, they would often talk about environmental education being a little fluffy, a little soft. Does anyone know what this is? I don't know what this is, this animal. Has anyone ever seen that before? I don't even know what it is. It's a hamster? Okay. But have you ever heard that environmental education, it's a what?
类似那个松叶鼠和黄金鼠的那种小动物。
But anyway, it's a crazy looking thing. So has anyone ever heard this though? That environmental education takes too long, it's, costs too much, it's only about kids. And then the biggest question is, how has education actually helped me accomplish my goal, my conservation colleagues saying this? So in a number of the organizations where I worked, and I don't know if it's the same here in Taiwan, the scientists and policy experts would be over here, and then the educators would be somewhere else, and often the communication experts were somewhere else, and often not working together, right? So we know that integrated conservation works better if science, policy, education, and communication are talking to each other, working together, figuring out what the strengths are of each, and we're all working toward a common goal, we're going to be in much better shape. So conservation is about people, and sometimes the conservation planning process leaves out stakeholders and some of the people that are going to be affected by decisions or actually have input into the decisions. And so a group of us talked about putting together a toolkit that would help us think about conservation planning with people in mind. And we called it the Tools of Engagement, and we'll talk more about that because we're going to go through it. And we talk about social strategies. So environmental education being a social strategy, a way of engaging people. But there are others, basic communication, social marketing, and I'll talk about that. So this planning tool talking about how you can engage people, and again, we worked with a lot of different organizations, just like you're trying to do here in Taiwan. This would not have been as good a product, and it's still in the beta form, if we had just done it ourselves without working with others. So we worked with Ohio State, Stanford University, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, Audubon, a number of us working together to come up with this Tools of Engagement. And you can access this online if you go to audubon.org/toolkit. And it's a PDF and you can get it online as we talk about it. Has anyone heard of something called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation? Anybody? Joe, that's good. So let me just tell you for a minute about this, and this is something else that you can go to conservationmeasures.org. So a lot of the conservation groups, many of them international conservation groups, got together and said, what is best practice when we're planning our conservation work? And they put this adaptive management process together where you're really conceptualizing what you're trying to do, and then you're planning the actions to monitor it, and then you implement it and you keep monitoring it, you analyze and adapt it, and it's an adaptive management circle that goes around. The important part is that sometimes we do planning, and then we never go back to the plan, and the plan didn't actually work. You want to be fixing it as you go, right? So the open standards is best practice in conservation planning. And what it actually does is you start off thinking, what does the world look like now? What needs protection? What's causing the problem? Who and what is contributing? So that's what are things now. But then you also want to look at, okay, if I intervene or our project intervenes, what is the world going to look like if we change it? So what are we going to do? What are we going to protect? And what are the outcomes? So you kind of have to know what you're going to be doing and have a target, or it's going to be really hard to measure your progress. So starting about what the world looks like now, and then how's it going to change as a result of your work. And this is for any project, anything. Sometimes we go right to a tactic. We think, I'm going to do a poster, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, without actually knowing and planning what am I trying to accomplish and how is this going to help me do that. So the conceptual model of how the world works goes something like this. You want to think about what is your target? What are you trying to protect? That's really important to know. What are the threats to that target? Right? What's going to hurt that target, or what is hurting that target? What are the contributing factors or root causes? What is really causing the problems, and digging into the root causes. And then, it's only then after you're figuring all this out that you think about, wow, what strategies are going to help address the root causes or help tackle a direct threat that will help me protect my target. So it's starting with, what are you trying to do? What are your biodiversity or environmental targets? And when I say target, it could be a species. You might be protecting an endangered species. You might be protecting a landscape. Think about this in your work, of the kinds of things that you have been trying to protect. It also can be a human welfare target that you're trying to protect. Clean water is good for the environment, and it's good for people. And then what are the threats? What's causing the threats? It could be overfishing, it could be mining, it could be whatever you think about your target, what's causing the problem? And then thinking about what audiences do you want to hit, what strategies make the most sense, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. And then how are you going to measure success? Okay, so how are you going to know that you've accomplished what you set out to do? And if you don't think about that from the beginning, it's much, much harder. Thinking about, you always want someone like Joe Heimlich on your team, Mr. Evaluator, who's going to help you from the beginning think about, how am I going to measure the impact? You can't measure everything. So it's figuring out what you have the time and money to measure. So a friend of mine always says, you can measure anything if you have enough time and money, but you never have enough time and money, so you got to pick. Okay, so we'll be giving these copies, and we'll go through this in a minute. But it's really following kind of a thinking process when you're doing planning. And if you leave out some of the steps, it might not be as effective. So quick run through of the tools of engagement. It's divided up into chapters. And the first one is like, know where you're going. Then it's understanding the problems, the people factor, what are you going to do? And I just want to say there are a bunch of tools in the back. So a number of you do workshops with other people. And these tools in the back can be used to help in a workshop. And the appendix has resources. So on the know where you're going when you think about planning, we're not going to go into all of this, but do you have the right team? Are the stakeholders engaged? Do you have a vision? Do you know what your target is? Do you have goals for your project? And again, when I'm saying project and a target, it's what are you trying to protect or restore? A species, a landscape, a polluted body of water, an entire ecoregion. What are you trying to do? And the biodiversity targets, plants, animals, landscapes. It just depends on what what scope of your project, but thinking that through is really important. And again, the human welfare targets. Because if you're protecting something like if you're tackling air pollution, by reducing particulate matter, you're also helping human health at the same time. You've got two goals there. And if both of those are goals, that's going to help influence how you do your planning. The next section is on understanding the problems in context. So identifying the threats to your target and digging into the root causes. We're not going to have time to do this, but I just want to explain what we would have done, okay? Because it's really important. This is the antithesis of experiential learning, me telling you what we were going to do. Okay, but if you think of a project and you were to write down your target, then you take the exercise, think of your target. Maybe it's protecting an endangered bird. What are the threats to that bird? And you write down the threats. And then what are the root causes of those threats? So if you have a threat like deforestation, you got to dig a little deeper to find out what is causing deforestation. What's the root cause of that? Okay? So you would take one threat, you dig really deep into what are the root causes, and what are the actions that people or groups of people are doing that are causing the threats or impacting the target. And then this is an activity that we often don't do enough to dig into these root causes. And you can do this with a partner. So say you take something like deforestation, and your first partner would say, what's the threat or the problem you're trying to resolve? And then you say, why do you think that is happening? And then you'd answer. And then using the answer you ask, why is that happening? And you keep asking why until you get down to the root cause, which is what you might want to develop your program around to tackle that root cause of the problem. Do you know what I mean? Does everybody get that? This is a really good exercise to do when you're thinking about project planning. And then on the people side, who's your audience? What are the short and long-term goals? What do you want people to do? Really important to know what you're actually trying to do. And to think about all the different ways we engage people, okay? Information, education, capacity building, communication, they all overlap. If I asked you all to define these words, you would have all kinds of different answers. But they all overlap and they all have some background behind them that make them very special. So in the homework we did, and Joe actually helped with the homework, and Nicole Ardwin from Stanford, we actually asked people what they needed and wanted, and a lot of people wanted more help when they're doing project planning on how do you decide which audiences. Of all the audiences, how do you decide? How do you decide which strategies? And how do you find out more about your audience and your strategies? So you got to think about things like who's directly causing the problems. Sometimes the people that you can reach are the ones who can influence the people causing the problems. You've got to think about who are you trying to reach and how much do you know about your audience. So I wish we had time to actually dig into, thinking about your audience and what you want them to do. Because sometimes we don't know our audience well enough to know what the barriers are that make them do what they're doing or make them not do something you want them to do. So if you've ever worked with audiences, do you ever hear these excuses? If I don't have time to do that, I don't really care, I don't really believe change is possible, I'm lazy. I hear that all the time from my colleagues mostly. I'm too tired, it's hopeless. And a lot of people, they don't think this is their issue because they don't see the relevance to their lives. They don't care about the environment, they might care about poverty. Okay, so we've got to make those links. So when I worked on a magazine called Ranger Rick, it was a kids magazine at the National Wildlife Federation, and I learned the 3 most important lessons for working on a magazine, and it's true for so many things. First one, know your audience. Have you ever heard that, know your audience? Really understand your audience? The second one, know your audience. And guess what the third one is? Know your audience.
You got it.
Because if you're writing an article and you don't know your audience, it is not going to be a good article for them. And it's the same with project planning, it's the same with working with any audience. If you don't know them, it's going to be very hard to reach them. So there are a number of activities in the toolkit about understanding your target audience. So I do want you to think for a minute of an audience you are working with now, in some project, what you're doing. Okay, think about it in your head. Everybody have an audience? Now I want you to think about what don't you know about that audience that you wish you did. Okay, does anyone have an example of something you wish you knew about your audience? Anybody? You know everything about your audience. There's nothing else you want to know? Because see, I often find that there are a lot of things I don't know about the audience I'm trying to reach. If I go into a city and you know there are a number of different communities there and there's a context and I don't know them very well, how do I find out about them? This is a really important question to ask yourself. Because if you don't know what they care about and you don't know what they can do or what their influence is on the project, you're not going to be as successful. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
And it's sitting down and thinking through this before we just go off and do a project. Because sometimes we don't think. You can do the same activity here. Who are your audiences? What do you know about them? What do you need to know about? And it's thinking about what do you want your audience to know, believe, and do. And there are lots of different activities in here. Like, can you paint an audience portrait? Can you answer questions of how old are they? Do they work? What do they care about? Do they have extra money? What do they dream about? You can do an audience portrait and try and get more information because that will guide you in putting a program together. And then the section D is what are you going to do? So what's your theory of change? We're going to talk more about that. Joe will talk a little bit about that. Best strategies, monitoring and evaluating your project, a plan of action. Because the other problem you can have in trying to link education and conservation is you never get to the action stage. You never get to the there. You know, you just keep planning or you don't work out the middle part there in terms of how do you move from planning to action. So when you think about a project that you're doing and you think about conservation goals, when do you use education? When do you use social marketing, advocacy? How do you balance short and long term? Which approaches for which audience and why? So there's been a lot of research about the role of education and social marketing in helping to achieve conservation outcomes. And this is really exciting, that the work that we are all doing in environmental education and the link to social marketing, I'll talk about that in a minute, is really helping us achieve our conservation and environmental goals. So we talked this morning about environmental education. It's not linear, but there's awareness, knowledge, skills, attitude, action. It's the process. Social marketing. How many of you have heard of social marketing? Raise your hand. Okay, number of hands going up. Okay, does somebody want to tell me what social marketing is? Oh, you have a mic. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I think that social marketing is a core action in the scouting because we have to reach everybody in the community in a different cultural background, in different age sections. That's our challenge. Yeah, and we have to find our strategy and the planning to connect them.
Yep. Anybody else? Good. Anybody else want to give social marketing how you view it a shot? There could be a bird.
Okay.
What is social marketing?
Okay. Social marketing, well, 我用中文好了。
Where's the bird?
Give me bird and then I.
No.
好，我用中文说好，大家比较容易知道。那一行销包括了产品 product， 第二个你必须要有 price， 你必须要付出代价啊。第三个place， 你要有交换的场域。第四个你要有促销 promotion。那这个跟 marketing 所有的市场行销是一样的， 但是社会行销卖的不是一个固定的一个产品，它卖的是一种价值，像是你不要抽烟，你的身体会好，或是一种保育的价值，所以它是对社会有帮助的。所以在这样子的状况，是适合用 marketing 的 strategy 去达成社会的公益的以及保育的这些的效果的这种行销叫社会行销。Am I right?
You can get it.
Yay! The thing about social marketing, as we've heard, is that it's marketing for the good of the world, okay? It's marketing that's helping the world, and you know what behavior you're searching for. Okay, in education, you don't have a targeted behavior necessarily. In social marketing, wear a seatbelt. You know what you want people to do. Now, how do you get there and how do you overcome the barriers? You know what you're doing. So how many of you think it's important to eat 5 fruits and vegetables a day? Raise your hand. Do you think that's important? Okay, not many of you think that. There you go. Okay, how about it's important to get 30 minutes of exercise 4 times a week? Important? Yep. Okay, you shouldn't talk or text while driving. Think it's important? Okay. How come people don't do any of these things? Okay, people don't act for a reason, and social marketing and education is understanding what the barriers are. So when social marketing and environmental ed together, really powerful, because social marketing only lasts as long as the marketing lasts. Education, the deeper thinking, the deeper learning is really important. And short and long-term strategies, how do you balance that? What's your strategy for societal change? I'm going to leave this for Joe to talk about your theory of change and evaluation and measurement. He'll talk about that. So the bottom line is planning is common sense. Okay, that says in convenience stores, if you can't read it, which I always think is funny. And the tools of engagement are trying to help us think deliberately and strategically about what we're trying to do. And so again, you can download that, and we'll have the toolkits for each center. And then behavior change is the next thing, and Joe's going to talk more about this. How many of you are trying to change the behavior of an audience you're working with? Raise your hand. Anybody trying to change behaviors? Just a few of you? Okay. And I'm going to go right down to this. So Joe's going to take it from here and talk a little bit about behavior change. And wait, click one more. Thank you.
So let's talk just a little bit about behavior change. I can talk about it for hours and hours, which is why Judy said we'd be here till midnight. Because I really do. Where'd it go? I picked it. It's in the same one, there. Thanks. So, very quickly, what is behavior? Define it. What are your thoughts? What do we mean when we say behavior?
What's the price?
No bird, but something. What is behavior? We talk about it all the time. Yes?
A move.
A move? Sure. Somebody else. What is behavior? That is a specific kind of set of behaviors, but what do we mean by the word behavior? So let me give you a little more technical definition of behavior. It starts with skills. Cognitive skills, fine motor skills, gross physical motor skills. All of those are skills. Skills together we use to solve tasks. A task is comprised of a minimum of 3 skills. Tasks put together lead to an action. Most of the time when we talk about conservation education, we're talking about an action. We want people to do an action. And it's a series of tasks supported by the skills. Actions are embedded in habits. Habits are things we do over and over the same way. When you get up in the morning, you have a very strong series of habits. Habits are held together in routines. If we consciously thought about every behavior we make, we would not do anything. How many of you drive a car? Do you know how many hundreds of behaviors or actions you involve in starting a car and backing it out of the driveway? Thousands. If you consciously made every decision, you couldn't do it. So we have routines. This is the challenge for changing behavior or dealing with behaviors. Behaviors are embedded in routines. And when we say we want you to change an action is embedded in a habit, which is embedded in a routine. What we're trying to do is get people to change routines. And that's hard. In a class on psychology of behavior and environment I taught, I used to tell the students they had to spend 1 week where they did not use water to brush their teeth. Toothpaste is 97% water. The only way you can teach yourself to do that is to put the toothpaste and the toothbrush in a different room. You change the routine so that you don't default. So behavior is complex. It's not a simple thing of turn off the light when you leave the room. That's not that simple. And we oversimplify thinking that behavior can be taught by telling them. Interesting concept is that routines are part of constellations. Constellations are things that hold them together in our heads. And our constellations of behaviors vary from person to person. So, what makes it complex? There is no one motivation, no one definition of behavior. There is no one context in which behaviors work continually and for everyone. There is no one predictor of what will cause someone to do a behavior. There's no one model of why people act the way they do. People are complex things. My background is ed psychology, and I studied under Gestalt. Don't you love it? I'm throwing out lots of technical words. I'm sorry. So Gestalt talks about a human being is a very complex thing. Then you put this one complex thing with another complex thing. By the time you get to 3 complex things, people, together, you logarithmically increase the problems in communication and in behavior. So, how do we begin to teach them for behavior? Theory of change. If you want something, you have to do things together. That's the theory of change. You can't assume things will happen. If I tell people to do something, there's no link to the action of doing anything. It's a cognitive message to do, a skill, and there's no connection. So theory of change says if we want something, we have to do stuff to get there. Pretty simple. Except it's really not so simple, because it's predicated on causal linkages. Everything is intentionally causing the next thing. So if I want something to happen, I have to have the resources to do it. If I have the resources to do it, I need to do the right thing for the right audience. The wrong thing for the right audience or the right thing for the wrong audience doesn't work. If you had, let's say, I know there's some zoo people, right? Back there, right? Zoos? Okay, I knew there were. So why did I pick on zoos? If I've got a zoo program for, let's say, 7-year-olds, and I get 12-year-olds who show up for the program, will it work? Probably not. It's a different developmental age, a different psychological placement, a different need. So if I do a right program, a really great program for 3-year-olds or 6-year-olds, and I get 12-year-olds, it will fail. If I have a program for adults and I end up with kindergartners, is it going to work? So it's the right program for the right audience using the right resources. And we then have to look at then, what are we trying to get them to do? All education is about behavior. We don't learn to learn. Schooling is about preparing young people to become a citizen, right? And the tools they need to be a citizen. So we're teaching about behavior. Everything we do is ultimately about behavior. So how do we begin to shift our teaching to understand the outcome we're after is long-term behavior, not short-term cognitive recall? I just said that. What we really are doing in this is what we call cognitive learning. Anybody familiar with conation? Not cognation or cognitive, conation. Old Greek word. It means merging. Merging of affect with cognition. So what we know, what we believe, feel, value, and care about, and then the ability to do something with it. That's cognitive. And it's how every person's brain works uniquely in how you put those together. But it tells us we have to teach not just information, but also beliefs, values, attitudes. We have to teach to affect, and we have to use skills in doing that so that those three come together for a person. All of this is intentional. Everything we do must be intentional, not assumptive. We cannot assume things will happen. We have to make sure they happen. And then finally, we need to look at what is short-term, what is mid-term, and what is long-term. Long-term always is our sustained behavior. Mid-term is when the behavior begins to fall into routines, when they begin to routinize. I won't go into causality. There are a lot of models of behavior in EE, and we could, do you want to talk about each one? I got the answer now. This stuff is fascinating. A lot of it, well, not a lot. Some of it is in here. This is a supplement, an addendum to the toolkit, and it's influence and conservation action. I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, I think. Where am I coming? Okay. So what I want you to do is you're going to pair up and you're going to talk with somebody sitting beside you about what are key behavioral outcomes you think the regional EE regional centers should have. And two things you need to consider in thinking about this. One, agency. Agency is the ability of somebody to act. Can the person do what you want them to do? So if you want people to walk instead of drive to work, if I live 40 miles from my work and the only way to get there is car, I have no agency to walk to work. If I want somebody to lower their energy consumption at home, who can do that in a house? Can a 3-year-old? Can an 8-year-old? Not really. It's the household considerations. So agency is the ability of a person to do the act. And then the other is proxemics. How close is the person to the action? How relevant is it to their lives? So if you're in the middle of, let's say, a desert, and you're doing a program, you want people to care about ocean acidification, it's really, really hard. It's not relevant. So how do you make the behavior relevant? What is relevant to them? And finally, the last piece, there is no one behavior to get to the outcomes of conservation we're after. How many of you teach you should recycle? Anybody teach that it's a good thing to recycle and you should how to recycle? Wow. One of the difficulties is a lot of people say, when you tell people what should you do, what's environmental, people say, oh, recycling. Recycling is not a conservation outcome. What's the conservation outcome for recycling? Anybody know? Reduction in waste. What's a better way of reducing waste than recycling? Don't buy it. Don't buy it. So what we're really after is not recycling, we're after waste reduction. And there are lots of ways to do it. Recycling is one fairly far down the line way of reducing waste. So don't get stuck thinking there's one way to get to the conservation outcome. There are always lots of ways. Okay, so now, pair up. You're going to have 5 minutes to come up with 2 or 3 key behaviors you think the regional environmental ed center should have. You should be talking. You should be talking. Pair up, talk. Okay, what I want you to do now is, how many of you are in pairs? Raise your hand if you're in pairs. All right. I think we were talking about other things. But that's okay. The point tomorrow, when we're talking, we're really getting to work on what are the centers, the EE regional centers to be doing and planning and thinking through. It will be very important to think what are the key conservation outcomes each center is after. And to be very clear on those, because that's how we begin planning. And that's then how we also measure. We can measure against those behaviors. Just want to end this section with just a little bit, another shameless plug. This is the Influencing Conservation Action. It's an addendum to the toolkit. And this was developed in a really sort of fun way. We asked a lot of conservation educators and then a lot of conservation scientists what they wanted to know about behavior. They gave us a lot of questions. And so some of the sample questions were like these. And then what a couple of us did was we wrote very academic responses to those questions. And then it was given to a writer who translated the very academic writing into very comfortable, easy language for practitioners. Talk about that actually in a later section. So the idea is that there are 20-some questions that guide what people most want to know about behavior, and to squelch a lot of the mythology around behavior, because people think they know behavior, and they don't. So, I think we are now what, on a raise? Not yet. Okay. Thank you.
非常谢谢2位讲者能够深入浅出的把保育跟环境教育的关系能够把它连接起来。我想最后我总结的是我自己学到的最大的心得是，我们做环境教育不是为了做环境教育而做环境教育，我们做环境教育是因为我们要达到了环境保育跟环境永续发展的这个目标而去做的环境教育。那这是我这一个阶段所学到最大的收获，好像。